I'm Joe Nye, the Dean of the Kennedy School, and it's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker as somebody that I knew when I was in the Clinton administration as one of the towering figures of that administration, and that's Mickey Cantor, who is the 31st U.S. Secretary of Commerce, though that's only for the last 6 months. Before that, he was distinguished as the United States Trade Representative. Mickey was born in Nashville, Tennessee, has his bachelor's degree from Vanderbilt, served in the Navy, and his law degree is from Georgetown. In addition to practicing law, he's been involved in numerous presidential campaigns, starting with McGovern, Carter, Mondale, and in '92, he was chairman of the Clinton-Gore campaign and was obviously quite successful. He was also quite successful, not only quite successful, very successful as the President's chief advisor on international trade policy. He basically negotiated more than 200 trade agreements ranging from textiles and automotives to protection of intellectual property rights, and was critical in the approval and implementation of the NAFTA agreement. But as a negotiator, he is well renowned not only internationally but domestically. As some of you may know, he was the negotiator who handled the debates format this year in the presidential campaign, and I think he was quite successful there as well. As head of the Commerce Department, Mickey has to fill very large shoes. His predecessor, Ron Brown, who was chairman of the advisory committee of the Institute of Politics, was well known, well beloved in this institution. And we are sorry to have the loss of Ron, but I'm sure that Mickey, in fact, will be able to fill those shoes very well, not only in the area of international trade and increasing jobs through increased exports and expanded markets, but also in terms of economic development of less advantaged communities within the United States. Today, he's going to talk to us about the global economy in the 21st century. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Mickey Cantor, Secretary of Commerce.
Thank you, Dean Nye. Joe, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I was hoping you'd go on longer, but I know we're short for time. Thank you for what you're doing here. Thank you for what you did for this administration and for your years of public service. And I think I ought to give Dean Nye a hand for what he has done. Thank you. I have so many friends here. I do want to mention them, starting with Heather Campion, who all of you know, and someone named Chuck Campion, who has some relation to her. I've known Chuck for a number of years. I met Chuck when he was 12, so he's still a young man, although I am not. Nick Metropolis, who was involved with me in many of my nefarious activities over the years. You know, that list you read, Joe, of my campaigns is not exactly what you call a winning record, but I'm a Democrat. But let me just say this, I quit on the last one, and that was a good one. Let me also say hello to Phil Sharp, who is doing such a good job here. Roger Porter and Graham Allison, thank you for hosting me here tonight. Appreciate this very, very much. David Wilhelm is here. David is here for a year. David and DG are not only friends. I would not be standing here if it weren't for David Wilhelm. I hope all of you recognize what he did in 1991 and 1992, beginning in August and September, as we started that long run when we, of course, were odds-on favorite to be President of the United States in those days. I think there were 6 or 7 of us. David did tremendous work for the president. He's one of the brightest lights, not only in American politics, but in our country. And David, thank you for coming here tonight. Appreciate it. Governor Mike Sullivan and Jane Sullivan are here, great role models for all of us in what you can contribute to this country and what they have done. And you're a great asset to this operation here, which is so historic and storied. And there's someone here many of you don't know. Her name is Martha Diepenbrock. And let me tell you about Martha Diepenbrock. She's from Los Angeles. She started something called the Los Angeles Conservation Corps, taking kids 18 to 23 and junior high kids in a tough, no-nonsense, highly disciplined program of work, getting them off the streets, kids at risk. Was successful in doing it, taking them into skills where they go from streets to work out of gangs. It was, the president visited twice as governor this program. Part of what you see today in AmeriCorps comes out of what Martha did. She's now here, and Jody, be congratulated for having Martha here. There is no greater hero in America than the Martha Diepenbrocks we have among us, and she is a true inspiration to all of us. Martha, where are you? You're here somewhere. She's probably way up there. I want to talk about, we're on the threshold of a new century, but that's only symbolism. More important than the symbolism is we're on a threshold of a different reality economically and socially and politically, and it has to do with what is going on in world trade and interdependence and globalization and all these things that have happened right before our very eyes. It's exciting, it's challenging, it means change. It's an enormous opportunity for our nation and for the world, but it carries with it corresponding responsibility. A little background, I think, is in order here. In order to get to where we are today, we had to go through the policies rooted in the Cold War, where strategic and political issues rightly ruled the day. They were dominant. We built our strength of our trading partners and allies in Europe and Japan as bulwarks against Soviet expansionism at that time, through opening our markets and allowing others to keep sanctuaries in order to grow employment and standard of living in industries, which was the right policy at the time. Trade clearly was a tool of the Cold War and one that was used very effectively by the United States and our allies. We also defined the policies of the Cold War as mutual assured destruction was one and containment was the other. Much of our relationships around the world and the Soviets' relationships and other relationships were defined by East-West confrontation, conflict, and competition. We also at the time had a self-contained economy. That exacerbated the tendency to use trade as a tool. Now, why was that so? If we were, in 1947, 50% of the world's gross domestic product, we didn't need trade to grow jobs and raise our standard of living. In fact, we could use trade as the tool which I was mentioning before. And so you could contrast Europe and Japan and others who needed trade to grow their economies because they weren't self-contained with our advantage that we had. But over the last number of years, this has changed, and changed in the most profound way. But some of that change was not recognized quickly enough until, frankly, this president came into office. One of the results of that non-recognition of interdependence, globalizations, trade, a post-Cold War world, a post-industrial society was that Americans viewed trade, and this is the most serious issue of all, as a tool, not in their interest, in fact, costing them jobs, not creating jobs. In fact, they were not wrong. In fact, that's exactly what we did, but we were so strong and so dominant, it made little, if any, difference during those years. In addition to all of that, economic power is spreading around the globe. If we were 50% of the world's economy in 1946 and 1947, we're 21% today, and we're going south. Now, I'm not saying that in a negative sense. That is positive. As other countries grow and industrialize, build a middle class, democratize, grow market economies, we have enormous opportunities, of course. Demographics have also changed our lives and exacerbate or create, I think would be better, this great opportunity I see out of the change in the Cold War and what we're doing, and that is we're 4% of the world's population. That means 96% live outside our borders. We are graying as many of us can attest to. We're getting older. We're a mature economy. We won't grow as fast. We won't be as young. We won't have as fast a growing labor force. We won't grow as economy as fast as the developing nations of the world. Certainly Japan is suffering some of that right now. We are beginning to look at that in a very serious way. But that again creates a new reality. International economics, I've mentioned, it became globalized and interdependent as money and ideas flash around the earth in an instant. Trade was not far behind. And economics is becoming, will become, and even more so in the future, the way we relate to each other. These new realities dictate new policies. They dictate policies of engagement, not containment. They dictate policies of the international economics joining foreign and domestic strategic and political issues at the foreign policy table. And they also dictate that mutual assured destruction has got to become mutual assured prosperity. These are not just a play on words. It is a dramatic change in the way we need to look at the world. So we've gone from mutual assured destruction to mutual assured prosperity as a goal. In a minute, I'll talk about how we think we can get there, and from containment to engagement, because there are no alternatives in this modern world. When the president came into office in January 1993, he talked about restoring the American dream. In fact, on October 3rd, 1991, as David will remember, he started on that day in Little Rock, Arkansas. He's been talking about his entire terms as governor of Arkansas, of how we could restore the American dream. He saw that trade was even more critical than it ever had been. It meant more jobs, higher incomes, higher standard of living, because trade jobs on the average pay 13 to 17% more than other jobs in our economy. He saw a world where our technologies was needed to build their industrial base and to fulfill their economic dreams. But he knew we couldn't take advantage of this new world, growing economically, becoming more democratic, more market economies, more industrialization, greater middle class, younger, faster growing, unless we restored our national economy first. There is no way in the world to take advantage of world markets unless you become competitive and productive. Prior to 1994, for 10 years in a row, we hadn't been the most productive and competitive economy on earth. We had lost that to the Japanese economy. He also saw the private sector as the engine of growth, but government had a role to play, a critical one, as a partner, to clear the tracks, remove the debris, let the engine of growth go forward, which was the private sector. He also understood we needed to create new capital for new technology in order that we could take care of what was our comparative advantage in the world, which is in the high technology area. And certainly you understand that here in Massachusetts. But high technology is not just bioengineering, it's not just software, it's not just hardware, communications equipment, or medical imaging systems, it's also agricultural products. Just look what others are doing in our society with bioengineered foods. So it covers the gamut of products in our society. What was the domestic situation the president faced? A slow to stagnant economy, 7.5% unemployment. We'd lost 2 million manufacturing jobs in 12 years. We had a growing budget deficit and a huge national debt. The debt had quadrupled in 12 years. The deficit was at $290 billion. We had increasing poverty and increasing income inequality, which might have been the most difficult problem of all. We had a declining competitive edge. We had lost our lead since 1979 as the greatest producer of automobiles in the world. Now, why do I mention automobiles? Not just because it's a symbol of America's strength. The auto industry employs about 9% of the manufacturing workforce in our country. It's the greatest purchaser of platinum, flat glass, rubber, steel, aluminum. So it has enormous ripple effect in our economy. We had the highest deficit to GDP among all the G7 countries. Investment in the 4 years before our coming to office was minus. Investment in our economy was minus 0.4%. And we had lost a number of jobs. We needed to be bold, we needed to be courageous, we needed to be decisive, and that the president was. We needed to cut the deficit. We need to make sure we quit taking so much money out of the economy into funding a deficit and put more money back into capital in order to grow America's private enterprise system. What did the president do? He passed an economic plan by a landslide, one vote in the House, and Al Gore cast the vote in the Senate. We've noticed every time Al Gore votes, we win. I think that should be number one on his resume a few years from now. Cut taxes on the working poor, which represented 16.5% of American taxpayers, 15 million American families, 40 million Americans. Cut taxes on small business once in 93, and we did it again in 96. We decided education was the key if we were going to be competitive and productive and be able to compete and win in world economy. And so what did we do? Goals 2000, School to Work, more money for Head Start, reform Title I, AmeriCorps, direct student loans. The president decided the greatest asset we had were human beings, and we had to invest in them. And then the president said, once we were able to restore our economy, we then could look to opening up foreign markets, and of course we had a very heavy agenda. What's happened to our domestic economy? 14 straight quarters of GDP going up, 4.7% in the last quarter. Investment is up 8 to 9% a year in the last 3.5 years, as compared to 2.6% in the Reagan years and minus 0.4% in the Bush years. 10.5 million new jobs, 2/3 of which are in high-paying industries, 93% of which are private sector, the highest percentage of jobs created in the private sector by any administration since Harry Truman. Unemployment dropped to 5.2%. The Dow today is well over 6,000, I think 6,050 some odd. We have the lowest misery index in 28 years, the highest corporate profits in 28 years, and the poverty rate 2 years in a row has gone down. It's the greatest drop in the poverty rate in any 2 years in the last 23 years. Average hourly wages for the first time in 21 years are now exceeding inflation. And we had the greatest rise in 1995 in real median income, family income, in 10 years. The deficit is now 63% below where it was, $109 billion this year. We're heading towards a balanced budget. We have the lowest deficit to GDP of all the G7 countries. We'll have the smallest federal government at the end of this year since Jack Kennedy was inaugurated President of the United States in January 1961, and per capita, the smallest federal civilian government since Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated in 1933. So private economy is booming. Even Bob Dole says it's the best economy in 30 years, he said to the New Hampshire legislature on February 13, 1996, so I can be precise. But we had a challenge, and the challenge is nonetheless important and difficult, and one we need to pursue with great commitment and tremendous passion, and that is, what are we going to do about impacting foreign markets? Here's what the president said. The president went to American University on February 26, 1993, and he said, we welcome the products and services of others into our market, but we expect the same treatment in their market as well. Simple, precise, to the point, different, and effective. And we have pursued that. We pursued it in the Uruguay round, we pursued it in NAFTA, we pursued it with the Japanese auto agreement, we pursued it with China with IPR agreements, we pursued it in 200 trade agreements in 44 months, the most in American history. Our strategy was simple, direct, clear. Reach trade agreements, open markets, create regional organizations, which we have done. Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, Free Trade Area of the Americas, NAFTA, the transatlantic marketplace with the European Union, And I'll come back in a minute why regional organizations versus always focusing on multilateral organizations like the WTO. Completed the Uruguay round. I'll tell you the story in 10 months. The president called me in February 1993, and he said, Mickey, I want you to finish the Uruguay round. This is after 8 years. Uruguay round by December 15th. And I said, Mr. President, which year? He said, this year. I didn't think it could be done, but he rolled up his sleeves. A lot of good people in the administration rolled up their sleeves. A lot of our trading partners understood the importance of it, including the European Union. We had a Peter Sutherland at the GATT who did a marvelous job, one of the brightest people in international trade in the world, and we were able to put that together. At the same time, of course, we were pursuing NAFTA. NAFTA had tremendous importance for this nation, far beyond creating the largest regional trade organization in the world. Why was NAFTA so important beyond that? Sure, it meant jobs. Sure, it meant lowering tariff barriers. Sure, it meant sending exports and not jobs to Mexico. Certainly, it locked in the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement. Yes, it meant we were beginning to focus on our hemisphere, the second fastest growing hemisphere in the world. Only Asia was growing faster. But more important than that, what NAFTA did is create a national debate. As painful as it might have been at some points in 1993, what it did is allow this president to talk to the American people and articulate how important trade was to their future and start to create a constituency among people who had been so skeptical about trade because they'd lived through the Cold War, and now they were seeing how it was in their interest, not to their detriment. That's not been talked about much. That building of credibility for trade and international economics and being interdependent and taking advantage of globalization, and yes, I hesitate to say even being international in our outlook, makes a huge difference in terms of American leadership and peace and stability and progress around the world. So the NAFTA was done, and then we did the Uruguay round. In between, the president went to Seattle and met all the Asian leaders, but one who didn't show up for that meeting. He has since come to the next two meetings. It was an enormous step forward, and now we're moving towards open trade in Asia by the year 2010 for developed countries, 2020 for developing countries. The Free Trade Area of the Americas on December 11, 1994 is the next step towards building open trade, fair trade, level playing field, reciprocity in this hemisphere, bringing together Brazil and Argentina and Chile along with NAFTA in order to build a huge market, a huge open market in this hemisphere. And so what we had done with the 200 agreements is said we're competitive and productive, and we have restored the U.S. economy. It needs to move forward, but with that new competitiveness, and we've been the most competitive, productive country in the world for 3 years in a row, 3 years in a row now, we must open foreign markets because you cannot create jobs and raise standard of living unless you increase your markets if you're at zero population growth. It just doesn't work. The numbers aren't there. As I said before, if you're 4% of the world's population, your consumers live somewhere else. And so we're moving in the right direction. In 1995, we increased our exports more than any other country, increased its exports in all of human history. Now, what are the next steps as America tries to move forward and provide leadership in this all-important area? As we try to bring ourselves ever closer to cooperating with countries around the world, as I said, a policy of engagement and mutual assured prosperity. One is there are new issues and bold approaches we must take. One is regionalization or regional arrangements. Now, why do I say that? There are those among you who will challenge me, I hope, on that and say, no, we ought to move on a multilateral basis. We ought to strengthen the WTO. We must pay complete attention to it. Look, the WTO is important. We need to strengthen it. God knows I spent enough time trying to make sure it came into reality working for the president, but I've got to tell you this. You can walk and chew gum at the same time. These regional organizations are interesting tactically and strategically because there are fewer countries than in the WTO, which is now 123 nations. Their problems are more precise and are more connected to each other than when you have this huge diversity of countries. You tend to have more leverage with them as the United States, and you tend to be able to move more quickly. What we don't need is 8 more years of negotiations without movement in a world that is moving so fast that it almost exceeds the ability of government to meet its speed of increase. And so the first thing is regional organization. The second is strengthen the WTO. The third is meet the new issues that we have to meet in trade. It's labor rights, which we have concentrated on more than any administration in history, regardless of what you might read in certain local newspapers these days. I'd be happy to talk about that, and delighted, in fact, to talk about that. The environment, enforcing antitrust and anti-competitive laws, knocking down barriers to investment, making sure standards are comparable and mutual, making sure we get rid of government support and subsidies for programs that give unfair advantages to other countries in competing with the U.S. and their other trading partners, and also to address the most pernicious problem of all, that's bribery and corruption in international trade. That's a speech all in its own. There is no more important problem we need to meet than that. Every business person you talk to will tell you it is the most important problem they face. The second thing we need to do after meeting these issues is to make sure we have a policy of reciprocity. With economic power spreading around the globe, and with the United States a smaller and smaller share of the world's GDP, and with nations growing and building a middle class and competing with us as they should and as we should welcome, we must also insist we all eventually play by the same rules. We're not doing that today. We're phasing into that in the Uruguay round. We're phasing into that in NAFTA. We must ensure at the bottom line we all play by the same rules for 2 reasons. One, it means we can compete and win in world markets, and that is important to the American standard of living. But more important than that, that's the way to grow credibility with the American public in trade, where they believe their government and these rules and these agreements are in their interest. Then, of course, we have to make sure that we connect what we do to the inner cities and our rural areas and those left behind in America. It's not talked about much. Frankly, what has happened, we're building a trading economy in America that's going great guns, and we're raising incomes all over from management down to labor. But what we haven't done is connected to our inner cities and rural areas which have been left behind. It's an enormously important thing to do. No American can be left behind in this new global economy because we don't have one person we can sacrifice if we're going to be competitive and productive and compete. I'd like to finish maybe this all too long statement, but it's something I care so deeply about. We're talking a little bit about the next generation and be a little bit personal. I have 3 children, as I say, one of each persuasion. Two are older and out working. One is in public health. The other is, excuse my French, a lawyer. I'm a recovering lawyer. But I have a 13-year-old. She's the light of my life. I'm spoiling her to death. My wife constantly criticizes me for it. I'm trying to give her, as you're trying to give your kids and your grandkids, and I have 2 grandchildren now, every advantage that she can have. The best schools, the greatest support, the most love, the most books to read, America Online, internet, every new computer that comes down the road. But let me tell you about this young lady. She's bright, she's able, she's creative, she's terrific, she's ambitious, but her horizons and her dreams are limited by those in our society who don't have opportunity and can't come along with her. We no longer just compete with each other. We are together competing with the whole world. To the extent we don't educate and train and give opportunity and raise our inner cities and build our rural areas and connect what's happening to trade to all of that and make sure we grow this country in a fair and equal and productive way, her horizons are limited by that mere fact. Now, I'm not going to stand for that, and nor should you. And so as we talk, sometimes theoretically, sometimes pragmatically, about building our economy and growing jobs and building profits, profits is a good word, and raising capital and creating technology, we've got to talk about raising every human being in America to a level they can compete with anyone in the world. Because I don't want that 13-year-old's dreams to be dashed on the failure of this country to provide opportunity to every American. Thank you very much.
Secretary Cantor has agreed to take some questions. There are microphones here on the floor and 2 in the balconies. I'd like the first questions at each microphone to come from Harvard students. And I'd also ask you to please be brief in respect for those who are in line behind you, and 1 question per customer. First question here.
Thank you. My name is Avery Gardner, and I'm a senior at Harvard College. And I was very interested to hear what you had to say about not leaving any Americans behind. I was hoping that you could fill that out a little bit more for us. Tell us what sort of specific efforts you have engaged in particularly in cooperation with the Department of Education. And this isn't a 2-part question, I promise. And then
I'm a lawyer, I don't take compound questions.
And I'd just like to know if you think that's threatened by the Republican Congress's animosity towards both the Departments of Commerce and the Departments of Education.
Ooh. That's what is known as a fastball right down the middle. I'm not going to answer the second part. You know my answer, and let's talk about what we need to do. The answer is yes, through their National Technology Information Administration, headed by Larry Irving. What we're doing with putting computers in schools and the internet, we're in charge of locking up the internet to every school and library in America. We're putting as much as we can into there. As you know, the President and Vice President in California just a couple of months ago, working on that. We're trying to do that all across the country now through our advanced technology program, developing communications systems that help education, help us extend and expand educational opportunities in America, through trying to working with Dick Riley and I have petitioned the FCC to give free internet and superhighway or super internet services to every school and every library in America. We petitioned that. And so we're trying to move in that direction. But let me say, the president also, we want to teach every child before they leave the 3rd grade to read in America. It's shameful, shameful. Any child leaves the 3rd grade in America and can't learn to read. Now, the Commerce Department on Monday, we're starting a program. We're volunteering. We're going to go out Monday. We picked a school in District of Columbia. We're going to go there. We're going to be there every week. We're going to help kids read. I hope every one of you here at Harvard, every one of the business you represent, every one of us follow the president's call and do that, because it's something we need to do in this country. We need to make sure every child with the ability and the willingness to do so gets an education, a college education, if need be, junior college education. The president has a $1,500 credit, $10,000 tax deduction. We need to do something about charter schools. We need to higher standards in our schools. We need to make sure that education and commerce are connected together in a way that builds our economy and brings every American along with us. Thank you.
This side.
Mr. Secretary, my name is David Calvert. I'm a student at the Kennedy School in the mid-career program. I'd like to thank you for your great speech, and it's full of hope, and it's a good feeling to know all this is going on. I also like to ask you, in reference to the visit we have next week from Mr. Boutros Ghali from UNICEF will be here, from the United Nations. What the United States will do about its the $1.5 billion it owes the United Nations, which it really needs to keep doing its work, and secondly, what you think the role of the United States in the United Nations should be in reference to international trade.
What was the last part?
How you see the United States should relate to the United Nations in terms of promoting international trade and cooperation.
I'll take the second part first, then I'll go to the UN and the money we owe and the situation that creates. As far as the United Nations and trade international economics, frankly, the United Nations in terms of peacekeeping, in terms of addressing political and strategic issues, and addressing health-based issues and education and so on, has done a marvelous job in many different ways. I think in the economic area, whether it's been the IFIs, the international financial institutions like the World Bank, or the GATT, now the WTO, much of that has been left to those organizations and probably should be. Now, there is an UNCTAD, as you know, that involves some of the poor nations of the world. They've been involved in the economic conglomerate working together on trade and economic issues. Frankly, UNCTAD has not been, people say I'm too candid, I'm going to be candid, not been as effective as it should have been and may not be the highest and best use of the United Nations. Now let's go back to what the United States owes and our obligations to the United Nations. Frankly, there is a connection here between the lack of credibility the UN has today because its failure to reform itself in a profound and dramatic way, and the position of Mr. Boutros-Ghali and the fact that the U.S. hasn't paid. Some of that has to do with internal U.S. politics, of which you're well aware. Some of it has to do with the inability of the UN to literally reform itself, and some has to do with lack of leadership at the top. We need to work on all of that. We need, of course, to make sure we try to bring along a somewhat recalcitrant Congress and people who don't have an appreciation for how important it is to build international institutions. They protect our sovereignty. What's fascinating about this, the more we build peace and stability and we build interdependence and globalization and trade and economics, the more protected we are in our own sovereignty. I think people who say the opposite have it backwards and don't understand. They're looking at the future through a rear view mirror. Right. And what we need to do is make sure we help the UN reform itself, build the credibility, and then I think the politics will follow.
And the money?
Right, Bill.
I think the politics will follow, which means I'm an optimist about that situation.
My name is Joanne Fan. I'm first year at Kennedy School. My question is, well, first of all, it's my honor to hear you talking about international trade and globalization. Asia Pacific has become one of the most important emerging markets. And in recent years, particularly China has been the most important trading partner with the US. My question is, in recent years, China has a trade deficit, rather, US has a trade deficit with China more than $13 billion. What would you propose in closing that gap, and in its importance, how soon would China become part of the WTO?
Thank you for the question. It's a critical one. There's not a more important bilateral relationship in the world than the U.S.-China, for all kinds of obvious reasons, strategic and political as well as economic. I've, of course, been much involved in the economic side of that relationship, and it has been better at times in the last 44 months, and it's not been as good at times. Frankly, we need to do 2 or 3 things that are extremely important. One, we need to make sure that discrimination against U.S. and other foreign competitive products and services, the ability to invest in the right to establish companies in China is not restricted by quotas, licensing arrangements, and opaque rules and regulations which do not serve China well, do not attract investment, and frankly are one of the greatest causes of this economic or trade imbalance that we have. That's number one. Number two, we've got to make sure agreements like our intellectual property rights agreements, 1995, 1996, which in fact I can report to you today are working in some aspects very well. China's closed 15 factories. They've taken away licenses. They've started criminal prosecutions. They stopped 15 presses that would make illegal CDs, CD-ROMs in these factories at the border, and they were shipped, unfortunately, elsewhere, but at least we stopped them from coming into China. We, working with China, let me make sure they get the credit, they've carried out thousands of raids on retail and wholesale establishments that have destroyed hundreds of thousands, not millions of CDs and CD-ROMs. Now, have we solved all the problems on intellectual property rights with China? Absolutely not. Have we taken great strides in the right direction? Yes, we have. Some due to what the United States has insisted upon, and let's give China credit, some due to the Chinese willingness and understanding This is necessary if we're going to move forward, and China's going to join the trading nations of the world in an appropriate regime. Now, the biggest step we can take is China joining the World Trade Organization, or gaining accession, is what we say in trade. We support China's accession to the World Trade Organization, but on a commercially reasonable basis. In October 1995, we gave China a 26-page single-space document, which we called a roadmap, trying to lead China towards where we thought China had to go in order to gain accession. All of our trading partners, all, agreed with that document and allowed us to carry on a bilateral dialogue with China. I met with Madame Wu Yi in Osaka in November. I met with her again, of course, as you know, just a few weeks ago. Charlene Barshevsky's met with her numerous times on this. I'd like to report to you today we've made a huge amount of progress, but we haven't. China has not shown the pragmatism, the flexibility, and the political will to meet even the most basic dictates of what that document reflected. Now remember, that document doesn't just reflect U.S. interests or U.S. views. It reflects the views of the European Union, Japan, Canada, and almost all of our trading partners, if not all. Let me just say all of our trading partners. However, I have a sense that China is trying to move in the right direction. Remember, this is very difficult. If you look back 15 years, you can see all the progress China has made, and it's quite stunning. However, as Americans, we're impatient. We want everything to happen yesterday. We're not going to settle for anyone not making changes on a 24, 48, 72-hour basis. So the fact remains is China has not responded in a way that would move the discussions forward. We hope we can move them forward over the next couple of months. I can't give you a sense of timing. I can give you a sense of our resolve, our commitment to engage with China at every level. Joe Nye is one of the great witnesses to this and one of the great architects of this policy. It is working. For those concerned about human rights, for those concerned about proliferation, those concerned about strategic issues in Asia, including the Taiwan Straits, those concerned about economics, the policy of engagement is the only alternative. And we're going to continue to pursue that, and I think it'll be successful.
Thank you.
Left balcony.
Hi, my name is Daniel Rosenberg, and I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School, and I want to thank you for your work on NAFTA. I have a specific question regarding Canadian-U.S. trade. Around the time that NAFTA was passed, the province of New Brunswick instituted a provincial sales tax such that if you're a Canadian coming over to the Maine border, wanting to buy goods in Maine and then bring it back to Canada, you now had to pay a tax. As a result, trade in northern Maine has collapsed with Canada. And I've heard from people that you've been very concerned with this issue and have looked at it very carefully. But the National Governors Association, I guess, has been against efforts to repeal New Brunswick's provincial sales tariff, because I guess U.S. states sometimes have tariffs against Canadians. And is there anything that can be done in order to increase trade along the border?
First of all, our trading relationship, it's a good question, thank you, with Canada is the largest trading relationship between any two countries in all the world, by far. However, there is a direct correlation between the size of your trading relationship with any country and the number of problems that you have. When I first started negotiating with the Canadians, I was 6'4". The provincial sales tax issue is one that has really harmed businesses in Maine, as you know, right across the border. We have had many, let's say, very precise discussions with the Canadians over it. There was also harassment of shoppers, as you know, coming back across the border. There's also an issue of potatoes. My friends in Maine have talked to me consistently and constantly about it. We've sent teams up there. We've tried to work with the Canadians. I'd like to tell you we've solved the problem, but we haven't. The fact is there is some differences of opinions among American states whether we should solve the problem or not, just because of what you just said, because U.S. states wanting to collect that tax. Some states like California and others don't want us to solve the problem because Canada may demand that we get rid of some of our practices as well. It's a very complicated problem. We've not made a lot of progress, but we continue to work on it.
Good evening, Mr. Secretary. My name is Peter Hatch, and I'm a second year here at the Kennedy School. During your compelling remarks tonight, you mentioned how critical it is to maintain.
Would you like to work at Commerce, like a job?
You already have one of us.
Yeah, right. My God, no one's ever said compelling about anything I've ever said. Complaining is usually what I do.
Well, you mentioned how essential it is to maintaining America's competitiveness that we not leave any members of our society behind. Yet, several months ago, it was reported that you were the sole cabinet secretary to recommend to the president that he sign the then pending welfare legislation that it was suggested by a Clinton administration report might push more than 1 million children into poverty. Would you discuss candidly with us this evening how you reconcile those two positions and what a second Clinton administration might do to make sure that a worst-case scenario under the new legislation will not, in fact, limit opportunity for growth in America and opportunity for your daughter?
It's a good question. First of all, let me give you a caveat here. I have never will, never have, David knows this, ever discuss anything I say to the President of the United States, and I never have. But I will tell you what I feel about that issue, and therefore you can draw any conclusion you wish. Let me just say that the reports in the newspapers, I know it will shock you, were not entirely accurate. I know that's a shocking revelation. I began my legal career working with farm workers in Florida. Before Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, who I also have worked with in my career, organized the United Farm Workers Union. There were kids working in the fields. There was pesticides being sprayed on these children and on other workers. They were using short-handled hose. They were the poorest of the poor. They were living behind barbed wire in armed camps in South Florida. We brought 2 13th Amendment suits on slavery. Now, I don't know how many of you are lawyers here. That's fairly rare to bring a 13th Amendment suit on slavery. We were quite creative when I was young. The fact is that every one, almost without exception, of my clients, the people I worked for, the people I cared so much about, were on welfare. It was an awful system. It denigrated people. It isolated them physically. It gave them no hope. There was no training, no child care, no sense of a future. The people who administered the program felt the same way, and they were denigrated by it as well. The taxpayers didn't support it, and we knew it was a system that was broke. None of us, though, including me, understood how to fix it, and so we used to stand politically and try to support it again and again and again, because we knew people's lives depended literally on those checks. When Florida cut welfare payments in 1969, I was part of a team of lawyers across the country, brought a case to the Supreme Court of the United States. We won. There's now a right to a fair hearing in welfare. So I have some understanding of this program and how it was administered, how it was run, what it did to people, and how they either survived or progressed or didn't progress or survive under it. The president running for office said we're going to change or end welfare as we know it. He vetoed 2 bills because they cut too much out of school lunch, because they didn't give any child care, because they had no training involved in it. That welfare bill changed substantially. Now, is it a perfect bill? Absolutely not. That part of the bill that's not connected to welfare, in fact, are parts of the bill none of us wanted. But we had to start reform at some point. And if we don't start now, when? When are we going to create dignity and hope and a future for people who have been left behind? Those are the poorest among us in our society if we don't do this. Now, this is a personal statement. The president is quite able, as you saw last night, to speak for himself. But I think we're on the road to creating not dependency but independence. I think we're on the road to training people, child care, growing opportunity in our nation if we just stick to it. The choices were not perfect. They never are. No question ever comes to any president that's perfect, because if it had been, one of us would have decided it way down the line, and we would have taken credit for it, I guarantee you. And so he gets all the tough questions. There was only one vote in that room, and the president voted. And he voted to begin the process of change, the process of reform. We've just begun, we've not ended.
Good evening, Mr. Secretary. Thank you very much for your very inspiring answer to the previous question. I have a question relating to international trade. I think the United States historically, and especially the Clinton administration, has been a very firm advocate of free trade and open markets. And I think this is in no small measure to your own enthusiasm and leadership to the process. Recently, I believe the United States initiated an action at the WTO to set up a dispute settlement panel to investigate access to the Japanese photographic film market. I think it's a commendable initiative insofar as it demonstrates the commitment of your administration to pursue the principles of free trade and open markets. At the same time, I believe the European Union has initiated action to request a WTO dispute settlement panel on the Helms-Burton bill. They argue that this policy contradicts, or rather selectively seeks to impose domestic law on foreign trade partners. How would you reconcile this seeming contradiction, especially in the context of what you said earlier in terms of playing by the same rules, and in terms of the United States' commitment to international institutions, especially the WTO? Thank you.
Thank you. Good question, and I appreciate it. First of all, I'm not a free trader. I'm not a protectionist. That's a sterile debate. It has no place in a modern world. I believe in open markets, fair rules, level playing field, reciprocity, moving towards a system where everyone can believe in it, and it will serve all of our purpose. Trade is not a zero-sum game. It's win-win for everyone if we do it correctly. So I just want to make sure that was. Let me move to your precise question. It's hard to equate the Fuji case, the Fuji Kodak case in Japan, with the Helms-Burton Act, but I'll try to draw some analogies. First of all, we led in 1947 the establishment of the GATT. We led the negotiation for the establishment of through the Uruguay round of the WTO. The U.S. has always been in the forefront of this. Others have gone along with us. We're not the only ones. Let me not take, for the President or anyone else, all the credit for this. Others have joined with us, and it's important that we do so. We set up a dispute settlement mechanism, and it's critical that that mechanism work and work correctly. We've brought 20 cases already, 5 times more than any other country in the world. We brought more cases under the GATT than any other country in the world. We use multilateral institutions. The Fuji case is a case we believe of discrimination against foreign competitive film, not just Kodak, but AGFA as well as Konica, but that's a local product in Japan, in the Japanese market. I won't bore you with the details. We believe we have a strong case. It's been an enormous impediment to U.S. trade for a number of years now, and we brought the case just, last year, I guess, or maybe, last year. Now, let's talk about Helms-Burton. Helms-Burton bill started off in Congress. It was unacceptable. It had major changes. The administration was the architect of those changes. During the course of negotiating that bill, you realize the Castro government shot down an unarmed civilian aircraft in international airspace and murdered the people on that airplane. Castro then went to the United Nations and said, we're not going to have free press as long as I'm here. We're not going to have free elections as long as I'm here. Cuba has hardly been free, independent, and democratic. They're the only non-democracy left in the Western Hemisphere. What we're trying to do, and we have tried to do, it's been U.S. policy through Democrat and Republican administrations for years, is to make sure we try to bring around. We have opened up, as you know, certain aspects of our relationship with Cuba, with the Cuban people, in order to try to bring Cuba around. We believe the Helms-Burton Law not only is important, but it's consistent, fully consistent with our international obligations. There is a national security exception in the Uruguay round. You'll never hear this from my European friends. as there is one, by the way, in the NAFTA as well. We believe this fits clearly into that, given our concerns with the hemisphere and the security of the hemisphere.
Mr. Secretary, my name is Juan Verde, and until recently you were my boss, working for MBDA at Commerce. Can you please comment on what former Secretary Ron Brown used to call America's advantage, meaning how this country can utilize its great diversity in order for U.S. businesses to be able to compete?
Absolutely,
Thank
terrific
you.
question. There will never be a Secretary of Commerce the equal of Ron Brown. He took what was literally a moribund department and made it live and breathe and become effective and become a great advocate for the U.S. As you know, and I know. I work with him every day. I was his friend for 20 years. Our families are friends. I miss him terribly. I can't replace Ron Brown. I can only succeed him and carry on the legacy that we both were trying to pursue with the president's leadership. Ron Brown was the most optimistic, bridge-building, confident person I ever knew. There was no problem Ron Brown thought could not be solved. He was the greatest advocate for the strength of America's diversity in our land. He understood better than any of us, whether it's international trade or within our own borders, how our diversity, our uncommon backgrounds could create common goals and common purpose. And he pursued that in the most effective way. Let me give you one example. Now, I believe we are the world's greatest producer of music and movies and entertainment, not because we're inherently more creative or productive than any other nation, it's because of our diversity. Why are U.S. movies and U.S. music and U.S. culture so accepted all around the world? It's because we're such an open and diverse society that we reflect the culture and tastes and backgrounds of so many people around the world. And so that's just one small example of what our diversity can do for us. And so rather than railing against immigration and railing against those who come to our borders, those who bring such great passion and hope and energy to our economy and to our life and to our society, we ought to welcome them with open arms. And I appreciate your question. We'll continue to work on this as this administration and administrations to follow. There is nothing more important in this country than to celebrate our diversity. Who among us, unless there's a Native American here somewhere, is not an immigrant? My grandparents came from Lithuania and from Russia on each side. And so all of us have this immigrant background, yet this great commitment to the nation and our ideals and our diversity, and it is our strength, and I agree with you.
Thank you.
This will have to be the last question.
Mr. Secretary, my name is Josh Freeman. I'm a joint student at the Kennedy School and the Business School. My question is this. Several months ago, you spoke out about the fact that the United States was really carrying the water in our negotiations with the Chinese, with the Japanese, and that we weren't getting any backing really from our allies, specifically in Europe. And I think the case of China is a perfect one when you and Mrs. Barshevsky spend a lot of time beating your heads against the wall there, to be followed by Chancellor Kohl and
Feels good, by the
others.
way, when you stop.
I was wondering if you could comment on what the United States can do and what you are doing to try and get some more support from our European allies.
I'll try to give you a balanced answer. Sometimes I'm a little too flip about this, and I'll try not to be here at the Kennedy School. There are a number of occasions we do cooperate through the Quad, through the WTO, through regional organizations on a bilateral basis in trying to bring about more open markets and fair rules in trading, trade facilitation, more customs measures, mutual recognition agreements, and so on. However, there is some history, I don't want to be misquoted, some history of especially the Europeans and the Japanese and the Canadians, but the Europeans and Japanese most of all, standing aside, holding our coat, and watching us get our nose bloodied. Now, there's, in a sense, you can take that as a compliment. We're the strongest economic power on earth, with the strongest military power on earth. We have the burden and the opportunity and, frankly, the privilege of leadership. And sometimes you do have to act, and sometimes you have to act alone. But it becomes frustrating at times, and that's what you're referring to, statements I've made, when you work for months on an intellectual property rights agreement with no help from anyone else. In fact, some trying to take advantage of our ardent advocacy in order to build their own market share in a particular country, and China was a great example, and then running right in after we finish and, of course, demanding the same agreement. Now, that has happened time after time. This is not the first administration, nor will it be the last administration. The fact is that we've got to expect, as the world's strongest power, that that's going to happen. It may be frustrating, it may be anxiety-provoking, but that's just the way it is. We need to continue to try to bring our trading partners along. I'd like to end, Joe, if I might, just with one thing I didn't say. The fact is that if you look at the Uruguay round, there are 3 administrations who made that happen, not just the Clinton administration. Reagan administration, Bush administration, and the Clinton administrations. It was bipartisan, nonpartisan, supported by Senator Dole and Speaker Gingrich, as well as many other Republicans and Democrats. The NAFTA was 2 administrations, could not have been passed without Republican and Democratic votes. I would make a plea here tonight about trade and international economics, just like foreign policy. It is so critical to America's future and to the future of our children and grandchildren, to the ways in which we're going to compete and win and grow our economy. It can never become partisan. That would kill it. And I welcome the support of those in the Republican Party who have agreed with us, and there are many, frankly, and at times more in the Republican Party than the Democratic Party agreed with this president. Trade is a process. What we're trying to do is reach the goal of a higher standard of living, and we shouldn't make it a partisan issue. Thank you very much.
Mickey, as you can see from the number of people who are lined up at the microphones, we would love to have kept you here all night. We know your schedule won't permit it. Sadly, we're out of time, but we're deeply grateful to you for coming, and we wish you well. Thank you very much. Everything was good, but that was just a pearl.
Well, I spent my life,
Yeah.
more of that in my life
That-
than doing trade.
Well, it really was great.
Can I ask you if you were at Vanderbilt when my father was chancellor?
Oh, sure, of course I was.
Do you know that he'll be 102 in December 25th?
What a great man.
And still sharp as he made